Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to our talk, the various shades of supply chain, SBOM, N-days, and Zero Trust. My name is Michaelis, I'm a CTO at Immune. We're doing firmware security, but this is a combined talk with Alex Matrosov and Richard Hughes. Most of the offensive research here comes from Alex and his team at Binary, and most of the statistics you're going to see is coming from Richard. He is working for Red Hat and is the maintainer of the Linux Vendor firmware service and the firmware update daemon. So, our talk we're going to be a whirlwind tour through all the firmware security mechanisms we have in real normal UEFIs, what the vendors were up to in the last year, and what the attackers did. But first, we're going to talk about the defenders. So a short introduction. What's the point here, right? Why is firmware so a special topic? The firmware supply chain is different from what you have with normal software, right? Unlike your Windows, all the code that comes from that is in your laptop is not all coming from Lenovo or Dell or something. Actually, most of the code is coming from reference implementations that these SoC vendors do. They hand that off to the independent BIOS vendors. They add some proprietary stuff, hand it off to the ODMs. They collect all the different other firmware components that are in the supply chain, sign that thing, and then ship it off to you, and Lenovo just puts their label on it and sends it to you. So when you, for example, build one of these laptops, you have lots of different little firmware components that have to go in there. You get them from suppliers or subcontractors, and the way these binaries are distributed is based completely on trust, right? So if you add some kind of chip in there in your system and you need some kind of firmware, you're just going to get this from one of the subsystem suppliers. They just ship binaries, and there's no verification done in any way, shape, or form, right? So the OEMs collect all these binaries, sign them, and send them to you. Which is kind of a problem, right? So there's everything's based on trust, and we actually want to go to the point where we do not have to trust everybody. So there's this concept of zero trust, and when you Google it, you find a lot of marketing fluff, and you find like the 5 pillars of zero trust, and you find the 6 pillars of zero trust, and you find the 7 pillars of zero trust, and you find the 8 pillars of zero trust. And I asked ChatGPT to come up with 9 pillars of zero trust, and it's pretty much the same thing you read in all of these specifications. But under all of these pages of specifications, there's a pretty good idea buried here, which is the idea to first, we want to minimize our trust assumptions, and we want to take away all the implicit trust we have in our system. So the idea comes from networking, where you say, okay, I have an internal network, and I do not want to implicitly trust everybody who's in this network, right? I want to act like all my internal services are reachable from the outside and do authentication the same way I would do it for like internet-facing service. And this idea can be extended to firmware in a way that we say, okay, there are many cooks in the firmware kitchen. All of these people are kind of necessary, but we do not want to trust all of these people, right? We want to verify the binaries we get, at least at the point where we ship them to the customer. Why would you want this? So this is an excerpt from our last year's talk, where we talked about the USB-RT vulnerability, first discovered in 2016. It was fixed. It came up again later in 2017, rediscovered the same vulnerability. Why? Well, somebody in this supply chain didn't get the message, used the old vulnerable reference code, shipped it again, and the vulnerability appeared again. Same thing happened in 2020, same thing happened in 2021. In 2022, it happens 3 times. 3 different vendors shipped a vulnerable reference code because they didn't know that this code was vulnerable, and there should be like a new version that should be used. This is kind of the problem, right? You have this complex supply chain, and not only the code has to travel down there, but also the information. And if somebody messes up, you get vulnerable code that ends up in the customer's hands and in your data center, right? So what we want to do is we want to verify these blobs, and we want to verify them not only once when we get the system, but we want to do it continuously, right? Because you have firmware updates, and maybe the guy that does the initial firmware build got the message about the vulnerable blob, but maybe the guy that does the update didn't get the message, and then now we can reintroduce the same vulnerability again via the update path. So to make this a bit more clear, let's come up with a transparency hierarchy, where we say, okay, the most transparent thing we can have, the best case is you have open source software that can be built reproducibly. In that case, we can inspect the source code, decide it's fine, then we have a reproducible build process, we know what binary comes out of that, and we can trust that binary. Open source in this case only means that we can actually read the code, right? We don't really care about changing it. It doesn't have to be like MIT licensed, just the ability to be inspected. The lesser version of that is to say, okay, we have open source code that cannot be built reproducibly. We can inspect the code. We have to trust the build process or the person that builds it, but that's it. Aside from that, we can trust the source code, the blob. This is not really what the common case in firmware. In firmware, you have most of the time closed source blobs coming from some vendor. For example, Intel says, okay, this is the blob, you need that to boot my system, period, right? The worst case you could think of are closed source blobs coming from completely unknown sources. And this is not so uncommon in firmware. You often have blobs that on the outside say, yeah, they are part of the Lenovo like firmware package or Dell firmware package, but they're not really coming from these OEMs, right? They're coming from some subcontractor they don't want to talk about. So you have blobs from unknown sources. And you cannot do much there, right? You cannot ask the vendor about like the list of good blobs and the list of vulnerable ones because they don't know themselves. The only thing you can do are cross-checks to see, okay, are the blobs that I have here the same that somebody else in another organization, maybe in another country has, or do I have a very special blob where some bits were changed? It's kind of suspect already. But aside from that, you don't have really insight into that. So let's look at a standard Intel server boot, right? We start off with the ACM and the pay phase. These are, the ACM is a blob, signed blob from Intel. The pay phase is where the FSP lives, that does all the memory training and so on. The ACM does the boot guard. You need these two, they come from Intel, you have to use them, period. You're not going to get access to the source code if you're not an OEM. After that, things get a bit better. You have the Dixie phase, which is like the first part of UEFI, where all the drivers are. Part of that is open source, because the reference implementation of UEFI, Tiano Core, is open. It's on GitHub, you can just check it out. But this is also where the vendors put all their proprietary firmware in. So it's like half open, half closed. After that, you have the option ROMs. That's code that's injected during the boot process from peripherals. This is, again, completely closed. Then you have the BDS layer, which is, again, UEFI. It's part closed, part open. And then you have like your virtual machine in your container process. And depending on what vendor you choose, that can be completely open. Sadly, this is a kind of naive way at looking at the boot process, because you don't have just your host CPU, right? You have, for example, GPUs, you have network cards, and you have the CSME or CSE or PSP, TXT, and so on. Different names for the same thing, DME, which is a separate process, separate chip that runs in parallel. GPUs, they have bootloaders, they have operating systems, it's all closed. For the CSE, at least there are white papers that talk about, okay, how's the security working here? There is a list of firmware versions from Intel, but for example, for the white paper, I'm not aware of any like outside verification of that, so you have to take their word for it. And if you have a modern Cepher Rapid server, for example, you have something called a PFR, Platform Firmware Resilience, which is an FPGA on the system that also does verification. And this is completely open. So you can get both the bitstream for the FPGA and the firmware that's running on the SoC for free and open on GitHub. It's a departure for Intel, actually. I hope this is not an exception. And this is the new Intel we heard about. And then people tell me, okay, okay, it's all intransparent, but we got secure boot, right? It's all signed. That's fine. Secure boot only secures a very small part of the boot process. It's only the UEFI part that's actually signed. Everything else isn't covered by secure boot in any way. And even worse, if you look at the specification of UEFI, secure boot can be skipped for code that comes from a secure source with 15 quotes here, which is, for example, the flash image. So which means that for the Dixie phase that you saw where all the code is in, most of the time they are not signed. And this is real, right? If you look at real UEFIs, most of these Dixies are not signed because they come from a secure source, they are trusted in some way, and you only have to verify like the boot loader that's on the disk. And of course, you can just disable secure boot. You just have to go into the BMC or into BIOS menu and then turn it off. So here come the first statistics. They all come from the Linux vendor firmware service, which publishes and ships firmware updates for Linux systems mostly. They also do security analysis, and if you opt into it, this is sent anonymously to the LVFS. which turns out that more than half of the systems out there do not have even secure boot enabled. So it doesn't really matter whether secure boot is secure or not. People don't really use it. The good news, and this is actually the only good news in the whole slide deck, is at least the platform key, so that the core signing key on the system is correct on the most systems, right? But there are even systems out there that have broken platform keys, so even if you enable secure boot, it won't work. It's crazy. And yeah, if you look at the timeline, it's creeping up slightly, but it's not really improving that much. And the top here is 60%, right? So we're creeping towards like 50%, not like 100. And then, okay, secure boot sucks. Okay, I got it. What about bootguard? So this is secure boot plus bootguard. Bootguard only, this is the first one here. Bootguard only secures the initial part of the secure boot, right? Because secure boot is software only, you have to have some kind of hardware anchor here, and this is what bootguard does. Nothing else. Again, statistics, bootguard is configured on pretty much all systems out there. That's the good news. But on 30% of these systems, the bootguard configuration is not locked. So everybody who has root on the system and knows the protocol, how to talk to the CSME, can change the keys whenever he wants, which is crazy. But it's not really important because of these systems, 44% do not enforce bootguard. So bootguard is implemented via an ACM that has to be started when the system boots up. You can remove this ACM from the flash image, and the system will just boot. There's no enforcement here. Okay, so secure boot, like all the signature verification, that sucks. Okay, I got it. But you got this other thing, right? You get measured boot, you got trusted computing, which is kind of having a revival, like after these next generation secure computing-based disaster like 15 years ago. Things coming back. You cannot run your Windows 11 without TPM. And even the arch nemesis of trusted computing, the Linux community, is kind of warming up to the idea of like using it for credential protection and stuff like that. And there are some cool ideas here, right? Especially when you say, okay, we have these blobs, right? They are maybe transparent, maybe not, but we trusted them begrudgingly. When we have these blobs on the flash, it doesn't. We have no link without measurements to the actual state of the system, right? And measured boot allows you to do that, right? You get a list of measurements, what has been actually executed during boot, plus the data that has been consumed. And this gives you at least a link to your trusted blobs, which is a pretty cool feature of trusted computing. Reality is that the implementation is kind of not really secure. You have problems with ACPI tables, for example. They contain code, they are measured, but the ACPI tables that are used are not the ones that are measured, because there's a lot of patching infrastructure in Linux to fix certain problems with ACPI tables. So you only measure the input to this process. You're not getting really what is executed at runtime. These measurements, these PCR values, they cannot really be pre-computed. So if I give you a firmware image and tell you, hey, give me the measurements after you've run this, that is pretty much impossible because there are runtime information that go into these PCRs. And the way they go into, we don't really know exactly, right? So we know roughly what goes into it, but the exact mechanism is under NDA. Then there are also event logs that tell you a bit more information, but these are not really integrity protected. So you have to parse them exactly as they are. You have to understand every entry in the event log, otherwise an attacker can hide information in there, which makes them really hard to use. They're really designed for this kind of thing. And yeah, if you look at reality, there's a good chunk of systems out there where the events in the event log don't really match what's in the PCR values. So for this system, measured boot is not going to work anyways. There are also the problem with changes, because there are automated updates and you cannot pre-compute values. Any change from your measurements, you have to decide whether this was an update or an attack. And this is really hard if you have things like automated updates, which makes the thing really challenging to use. Same thing is with configuration, right? If you change the configuration file, yes, the measurements will change, but you do not know in which way they're going to be changed, because they measure pretty much internal structures of the UEFI. And of course, TPMs are not bug-free. The cryptographic implementations are buggy. The reference implementations are buggy. There was an out-of-bounds read and write vulnerability in the reference code. And this reference code is used by all the different TPM vendors as a basis for their implementation. So we're going to see lots of these vulnerabilities in the future. There were some attempts to fix it. Intel had something called TSC, or they have something called TSC, where they give you a set of measurements during manufacturing. Then you get the server booted, and then you can verify, okay, are these measurements the same that they are doing the manufacturing? The moment you install an operating system, these measurement chains are useless, right? RAM certificates, something similar, where they are more concentrated on the event logs, a bit more finer granularity. Same problem. They don't tell you everything, and even if they would, our RIM certificates are pretty much specification only. I've never seen such thing in reality yet, so it's not going to help us. But at least they're vendor agnostic, so they can be useful other things than Intel. Maybe good news, Measure Boot covers a bit more than just secure boot, especially with the CSE that got measurements built in. But again, it's not everything. Okay, so after I taught you a bit about the imperfect solutions we have and security mechanisms, let's see what the attackers were up to in the last year. As you may have noticed, there has been an explosion of malware in firmware in the last few years. The first ones, like Moonbounce and Cosmic Stride, they were like Dixie-based attacks, right? They were Dixie in the Dixie phase. And especially for Moonbounce, it has been active since 2014, published in 2020. They are rather old mechanisms, right? They use older mechanisms. With Black Lotus, it's super interesting. The first one is it's not a state-sponsored attack, but cybercrime. And the second one, it's a bootloader. So we do not attack the Dixie phase. We actually attack the BDS phase, the bootloader phase, which is kind of funny because Alex in his book, Bootkits and Rootkits, said that now, this was a few years ago, now with secure boot, the golden age of bootkits is over, right? Because everything is signed and you cannot just change something. Well, it turns out this was a bit too optimistic, mostly because the complexity and the fact that the only way to prevent these kinds of attacks and patch them is to use the revocation mechanisms, which are called DBX. It's a list of hashes pretty much that are no longer allowed to be booted, even if they are correctly signed. And updating this DBX is a very slow and intransparent process. So it took, for example, Microsoft, who is the main shepherd of this list, until May. They don't tell you which May, but it cannot be much because now it's 13th, right? Not 12th. So I looked at it last month, and there was nothing on Black Lotus related in any way. So it's very slow. And even now that we have this DBX, in order to fix the DBX on your system, you have to do a firmware update, right? Because it's data in the firmware. So everybody has to roll out these firmware updates. This is something that people are not going to do. I'll talk about this later. So if I'm an attacker, how do I get, for example, a signing key to sign my bootkit? Pretty easy. I just make a ransomware attack on some semiconductor companies. They all have these signing keys, right? Because they do firmware. And we have seen an explosion of these attacks on semiconductor companies. And it's not only ransomware, right? It's most of the time, it's just data breaches. For example, a Lenovo ODM called RCFC got a data breach where their whole code base for their Lenovo Yoga laptops was published, which is bad enough already, but in that code base, there was also the private signing keys for the key manifest and the boot policy manifest. These two data structures are part of bootguard. This is a core part of bootguard. You have the key manifest, which is a list of keys that are allowed to sign the boot policy manifest, and the boot policy manifest contains the hash and the range of the initial boot block. And this initial boot block is the pay phase that bootstraps secure boot. So now that I have this, and the key that is allowed to sign the key manifest signing keys, that is fused into the CSME. So this presumably cannot be changed. So now with these two keys, I can create my own boot policy manifest. I can create my own pay phase, sign that, and this allows me to inject code before the security phase even has started, right? So this is not going to be covered by DBX anyways. You have to update, well, in this case, you have to somehow unfuse the key and put a new one in. I don't know if this is even possible. But here's the good news. In order to do that, you have to write it to the flash, right? So you either have to do an SMM exploit, which is rather easy, sadly, or you have to have physical access to the machine to flash it from the outside. That is good news. If you wonder if your system, your Yoga laptop is vulnerable, there's a firmware hunt rule that Binary supplied. You can upload your firmware image, and they will check whether your key is fused, whether the key that's fused at your laptop is one of these leaked ones. Okay, now comes the slide everybody's waiting for, right? The MSI data breach. So binary was notified of that, and they saw later that MSI made a statement that was roughly, yes, we got a data breach in our internal infrastructure. Please make sure that if you download any updates, that you only get them from us. As a response to that, binary did a code and binary analysis of all possible updates that came from MSI over the last months to figure out, okay, is there any malware in there? And there were a lot of bad things in there, vulnerable code, outdated reference code, misconfigurations, but there were no malware. That is good news. It's just the regular garbage that's in these updates. What's a bit bad about these MSI data breach, again, they got their key manifest and boot policy manifest keys leaked, but also they got their firmware signing keys leaked. So now I can do the same thing with the LCFC vulnerability key, but I do not have to have physical access to the system, because I can package my malware and my new pay phase into a normal UEFI capsule update and push it as an update into the system, the same way that Windows Update would put an update, a firmware update to the system. So you only need root to issue this firmware update, and then you're golden. This is actually not the worst part about this whole leak, because the next key that got leaked was the Intel OEM key. Intel supplies their OEMs with a special key that allows them to enable debugging mechanisms and disable certain security features on production systems. So using that key, you can pretty much attach a debugger to the boot process and circumvent pretty much all security. We do not know whether this key was exclusively to MSI. It is certainly possible that this key was shared with other ODMs. So maybe it's not only MSI systems that are vulnerable to this problem. Again, if you wonder if your laptop is vulnerable, there's a firmware rule. You can upload your firmware, and we scan for that keys. Obviously, you may have more than one laptop, and this is like most of the problems. You have to do these things at scale, figuring out, okay, is my fleet vulnerable? Is my server fleet, for example, vulnerable? There's a mechanism in firmware update daemon, which is in a package you can install in all normal Linux distributions to do a security rundown of the system, right? Super basic stuff. Is the qubit enabled? Are my flash protections enabled? Things like that. So if you wonder about security of a system, you can run that. You do not want to have anything red here, right? This is the absolute basic stuff that should work, not like super advanced things. Okay, this is what the attackers did in the last year. So let's see what the defenders and the manufacturers did. As you may have noticed, firmware is getting pretty complex. And the security mechanisms and ideas that we have and tools that we have there are mostly focused on firmware as, okay, I have a few kilobytes of code, they run from top to bottom to set up the system, done, right? They hand off execution to the operating system, done. In real life, you actually have an operating system in there, you have multiple operating systems in there, you have UEFI, which is a complete operating system, with the driver system stack and a bunch of applications. And you have the CSME that also have their own operating system that runs in parallel. UEFI also leaves code in the system, right? You have something called runtime services that are active after the system has been booted. And the amount of code is only increasing, right? So a normal Intel server has often 100 megabytes of firmware on there. And the tools we have are not really made to work with that. Also, we have this complicated supply chain, which means, and because UEFI doesn't really separate code from different vendors, it's all like running in one security domain, pretty much. Which means that if you have a vulnerability somewhere in the system and a new one is coming up, you cannot just look at a single vulnerability in isolation. Because if you have, for example, two vulnerabilities that by themselves look pretty benign, or maybe they cannot be exploited, or maybe they can be exploited, but it's not really helping you much. It can be that later, when all of these vulnerabilities are combined at the ODM, they are able to be exploited and allow you to gain access to way better things than just the vulnerabilities by themselves. Right? We have an example of this later, which exactly means that instead of, and when you look at one vulnerability, you cannot say, okay, this is like the vulnerability, what can I do with it? But you also have to take into account all the other vulnerabilities that are currently out in the ecosystem, right? All the vulnerable reference code that nobody really patched, that is still out there. You have to always take this into account in the whole context of the ecosystem. And this is something that CVSS and CWE doesn't really think about. So yeah, SBOMs. SBOMs are actually pretty good news for the ecosystem. So some of these firmware vendors now have SBOMs. The problem is, so if you look at one of these SBOMs, you will find, for example, that Lenovo has like 20 different OpenSSL versions in there. Why is that? Well, because of this complicated supply chain, right? Every one of these little vendors, maybe they have to do some cryptographic operation, they have a hash function or something. So what do? They take OpenSSL, compile it in, and in the end you have like a firmware image with 100 of different OpenSSL versions. It's hard to tell. Of course, most of them, some of them are 10 years old, right? Many of them are vulnerable. But you don't know whether the vulnerable code is in there, right? Because OpenSSL is big, and maybe that didn't link everything, but just the hash function, for example. It's hard to analyze, but at least there's some step forward here. Right, the vendors. Not only do they care really much about security, they don't really care about patching either. So 1 month after our last Black Hat talk at Black Hat Asia, we realized that HPE, after the public disclosure date, 1 month after the public disclosure date, still didn't have their patches out for all the systems. So even if you wanted to install a patch, you weren't able to after the public disclosure, right? There was already an embargo disclosure before that. They had plenty of time, but they were still not able to do it in time. But that's not really important because even if there was a patch out, people are not really installing these patches. So we know, for example, from the Linux Vendor firmware service, which shipped a DBX update, right? Again, it's very important to have this revocation list. After some time, now 7 million people have installed that DBX update, which sounds like a lot, but if you take this as a fraction of all Linux systems out there, this is like tiny. It's probably less than 1%. Why is that? Of course, nobody does really firmware updates. It's scary. It's maybe unsafe. You don't know if the system actually boots again. There's no automated way, right? You have to actually do it yourself. You have to be notified by the vendor, hey, do you a firmware update? And people don't really do that, right? The situation is a bit better under Windows, where we have Windows Update that kind of pushes you to do that, and it's all automatically. But on Linux, it's really hard to get people to do these updates. And even when you do this update, they maybe don't even figure it out that there's an update. So for example, here's an AMD vulnerability, again, AMD reference code, that Bunny found this year that turns out was actually a reintroduction of a previous bug that was already found a year ago. And was published, and there was a CV out there, and everything was fine. But again, somebody didn't get the message and reused that vulnerable blob. It got rediscovered, and instead of AMD notifying their customers again, hey guys, you have to stop using that stuff, they just slapped an update onto the old blog article that nobody's going to read again anymore, which says pretty much so, oh yeah, by the way, from this 2022 vulnerability list, it reappeared 1 year later. That's it, right? No notification or anything. As a result, roughly 20 Lenovo's 1 year after the disclosure of the bug in 2020, we are still vulnerable to this reference code vulnerability. So yeah, this slide is a bit outdated. We are now at roughly more than 300 vulnerabilities in firmware found. We're only scratching the surface here, even if this doesn't look like it. Especially if you look at the complexity and the amount of code and like the kind of vulnerabilities are found here, right? This is not some crazy type confusion, data-only vulnerabilities here, right? These are super basic stack overflow, heap overflow, insufficient input validation stuff. And this is part of this stuff is in the SMM, right? The highest privilege level on the system. So we are still finding like the low-hanging fruits here. And there's still a lot out there. Yes, and maybe as a closure, we talked a lot about like AMD and Intel. The problem is not exclusively x86 related, right? Because ARM also uses UEFI now, which means that vulnerabilities in, for example, UEFI reference code can cross different SoC vendor ecosystems. And this happened, for example, with one. This is this one here, where there was a vulnerability in the UEFI variable handling. And this would allow, this was vulnerability in x86, right? But this also happened in ARM, and it would allow me in ARM systems to get into the like SMM equivalent, the trust zone in ARM, and exploit this via the same UFI exploit, which is super interesting. So now you not only have to look at all vulnerabilities across the ecosystem and see, okay, what an attack does an attacker gain with this new vulnerability. You also have to look at across different SoC vendors, right? What new ability does an attacker gain in the ARM ecosystem using this new the code in the new bug in the reference implementation of UFI on that were found on Intel systems, right? Makes it even worse. Okay, so maybe to close the talk, maybe a few other numbers. The vast majority of firmware that is in the Linux Windows Firmware Service doesn't even have an SBOM. So even SBOMs are imperfect. They're not even used. More than half of them do not have a security contact. So even if you find a problem, you cannot tell them. If you, against all odds, manage to tell them, it would take them a year, roughly, to patch that best case, right? As you see with HP, it takes even more than a year. It will maybe need another month or so. I talked about this a bit previously. BootGuard. Also, half the machines do not have the correct error policy in BootGuard setup, which means that even if BootGuard is run and has everything set up correctly, and it finds that there is a signature violation, it will just continue booting because there's no error policy configured. Again, half the machines that have an IOMU do not enable it. Every graphics card can just write over the kernel text section if it wants to. 10% of the machines out there have CSME in manufacturing mode, which means I can change any values in there, right? If I know the protocols. It's absolutely crazy to me. 60% do not have write protections on the flash enabled, which means because this Dixie phase is not really signed, because it's from the secure source, I can write it to the flash over the Dixies and get my code execution this way. And yeah, 1/3 of the CSMEs out there have open critical vulnerabilities that are not patched because, again, people don't do firmware patches. And with this, I say thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Last talk on the last day. Everybody wants to go home.
Are you aware of does firmware update manager on Linux but implementing like automated updates, or at least notify the user that he should update?
Yes. So it exposes the dbus interface, and there are GNOME UIs, and I think KDE also got something where they say, so hey, there's an update for you. It's not going to just update your firmware as Windows Update, for example, without asking you. Mm-hmm. But you can get a notification and say, okay, please update.
Okay, cool. Good to know.
Okay. Thank you again.